Merci beaucoup, EPFL pour m'inviter. And now I'm going to give my talk in English. I'm sorry. My French is schoolboy, so that's not good enough. Z Factory stands for Zero Fossil Energy Developments. And what we're trying to do is we're a cross between an architect's practice, an environmental pressure group, and a product designer. So we're in a strange territory. So some of the things that you hear me talking about may not be architecture, but it's all part of a complex, holistic attempt to deliver zero carbon, zero waste development. So thank you to Dan and Pierre for asking me to give this talk, and I'll quickly show some of these ideas. Being an architect, I don't like talking, so I'll just show too many slides. But the first idea is to communicate that the human population of the planet is directly proportional to the availability of cheap fossil fuel. And with peak oil, peak gas and peak nuclear all happening within the next 10 to 15 years, with simply not discovering enough mineral reserves to cope with increasing demand, particularly from the developing world, South America, China and India. It's clear that all of society, as we know it, will have to one day run off the limited supplies of renewable energy that are available within our respective national boundaries. And as climate change accelerates, and there's a great deal of controversy about whether climate change is happening, but in the UK, not too much debate. We're already finding spring comes 2 weeks earlier every year, and the weather is changing quite dramatically with very high levels of rainfall. But most important of all, flooding, too much water in the winter and not enough in the summer. So the traditional cliche of London as being a rainy, gloomy city is about to change. What's critical is that 2/3 of the world's productive farmland will be lost by the end of the century. And my country, this is a government slide from the Minister for the Environment, and the claim is if we continue with carbon emissions as predicted, we're going to have around about a 2-metre rise in sea level and the average level of the Thames, and great chunks of London will be flooded by the end of this century. So really, it's part of the architect's duty now is to examine how we work, how we can design low-carbon lifestyles and work styles that mean people can choose an alternative way of life without thinking too hard and without trying too hard. How do you slip into this new paradigm, this new way of living on the planet? And then there's another metric to discuss, which is the ecological footprint. The ecological footprint of London is the same as the rest of the United Kingdom. So all of the territory of the entire country would be required to sustain London. So where do all the other cities find their sustenance? From other countries, but other countries don't have or won't have resource to trade. And I come from a country where we've just spent round about £60 billion fighting for fossil fuel outside our national boundaries. So to say that we haven't got the cash or the money to change the way our infrastructure and move towards a society that run off renewable energy is ridiculous when we have enough money to fight for oil. So the strategy we do, and this is a slide I produced 10 years ago now, is to try and look at how you can get a step change reduction in environmental impact at the same time as increasing overall quality of life. And we did a survey working with a local environmental charity called the Bioregional Development Group in South London. And we found that a typical carbon footprint of a suburban Londoner in our area was a third of their carbon footprint was attributable to food miles, with the average British meal having travelled 2,000 miles from farm to dinner plate. A third was private car use, transport and commuting. And a third was heating and powering their home. And that was in just at the turn of the century. So what we said was, how do we address each one of these ideas within the master planning, within the building detail design, within the energy master plan, within the construction detailing? How do we design out cars? How do we maximise, how do we make a direct connection between organic farms and urban population? How do we give everybody gardens? How do we stop using agricultural land for housing, which is a big problem in the UK? How do we get people to share cars, perhaps run cars off renewable energy systems, such as electric vehicles? All these things are happening in Switzerland, and it's all very obvious to you, but it isn't, and it wasn't in the UK at that point in time. But above all, how can we generate enough workspace within the site boundaries for everybody to work on site, should they wish to at some point in the future? Because London's completely overcrowded. Public transport systems can't take any more load. And designing out asthma, and then designing out fuel poverty, and making things last a very long time, because as we run out of resources, we won't be able to build new buildings or new infrastructure as the resource shortage that's coming this century accelerates. So what we decided to do a long time ago was try and set up these examples called Z quarters, where new urban districts can be the refurbishment of one small house, or it can be an entire street or an entire urban block, or a number of urban blocks to make an urban extension, or even a new city. But the point is to show how you can live within your fair share of the limited amounts of renewable energy that are available on the national framework. That would be through the green grid, at the same time as generating as much renewable resource within your own site boundaries. And how can you do that, creating this zero carbon, zero waste social network and social framework, which actually demonstrates that the quality of life is higher than business as usual? And this is the key to it, because if we can't prove it's better, no one is going to adopt it because they're told to by politicians or told to by environmental pressure groups. It has to be what we call enlightened self-interest that helps people adopt these ideas. And we've gone well outside architecture. We've started setting up things called zero fossil energy farms, where food is grown without using renewable energy, without using fossil fuels. It's nutrient waste from the urban developments is fed back in to refertilise soil, agricultural systems, and food is delivered in zero emissions transportation using no packaging, so there's nothing to recycle. So that's how you set up a system, and then you can develop a whole framework where every single human activity feeds into the next, so there is no waste. And we're really interested in this holistic systems thinking. Very difficult it is too, and very hard to build into very small projects, because as architects we only get given very small jobs. But if we don't start to agree on a system like this and think like this, it's not possible to achieve this overall transition from a fossil fuel addicted society to one that is actually capable of running indefinitely using the natural resources from within its own bioregion. And a lot of people say, well, what's the point in all this green stuff when you just simply buy a punnet of strawberries from Israel, which has been air freighted over, or runner beans from Kenya? My response is you can go quite easily and buy fruit or vegetables from a local farmer's market in brown paper bags on a bicycle transported by your rucksack. And then all of a sudden you really need a zero carbon home and a zero carbon workplace. And these are the models that we've been developing over the years. This is the area of productive land between these two wiggly roads created enough subsistence food, if you like, and energy to run the linear community that was clustered around a solar-powered light tram system with swale zones and rainwater storage lakes feeding biomass coppice with combined heat and power plants and workspace mixed with housing around these little village greens. So that's very idealistic, very theoretical. And really, how do you then change that and move that forward into into a real practical project. And this is a house we built 20 years ago now in South London. It's not exceptional, but it did try and anticipate a lot of these agendas. And we don't claim our work's perfect. We know it can be better. We know you can all do better. The point is, you have to start somewhere and you have to improve on it incrementally. So this house was designed, we knew that the rivers were going to flood, so it had a completely brick ground floor. There were no plasterwork. All the services came down from the floor above. There was a thermally massive concrete first floor, and then a very lightweight timber frame for the upper 2 floors, which was mainly done for cost and reduction in embodied carbon. The building, we had almost no money for windows when we built this. So we built a conservatory out of softwood, and a very simple aluminium patent glazing system which enabled us to clip renewable energy systems in as we could afford them. And over the years, it's getting closer and closer to being a zero-carbon house. So money isn't actually an excuse for not delivering these ideas. So here you can see evacuated tubes, solar collectors added. There's photovoltaics recently been added to the top facet, and there's more coming as I can afford it. This is inside. All the rooms face south. They get good south light with carefully framed views to the east. And it's heated, disconnected from gas and heated by a wood stove and a small wood pellet boiler. And we've just started to, we have been trying to maximise our veg output given the very limited time that we have available. So if we can get a family of teenage girls to adopt these ideas, pretty well anybody can, because you can't get worse than a contemporary teenage girl in London at this point in time. Trying out lots of ideas. Wind turbines in urban areas don't work. But we tried this and we found out for ourselves. But interestingly, when we'd actually reduced our electric demand to round about a constant demand of an average demand of about 250 watts. Actually, that turbine really does work. It only doesn't work if you're trying to run a dishwasher, a washing machine, and all the normal household goods, a toaster, an electric cooker. So, all these ideas. The message from building this house was actually, you can just about get all these ideas to work if you've reduced your demand first. Then renewable energy systems really do work. And you really are fighting over watts. When I built this house, I had 6 50-watt halogen low-voltage downlighters in my living room. I now have 6 3-watt LED lights. And it's exactly the same. Okay? So over 20 years, we've seen a fantastic reduction in the amount of electrical energy needed to do the same job. Okay, the LEDs aren't quite as nice, the quality of the light isn't quite as nice, but you can play around with tints and filters, and one day they will produce warm light from LEDs. We then tried to look at living in suburbia, whether we could get electric cars to work. This is a French one. We've run an electric car now for 10 years. And more or less, the solar photovoltaic panels on the roof of the house are able to power this car for around about 5,500 to 6,000 miles a year, which is more or less our annual suburban motoring requirement. And where we are is we've just got to the point where all those ideas in that house are now commercially available from your local DIY store, and you can buy a kit house called Rural Z, with absolutely everything: solar panels, wood pellet boiler, super insulation, passive heat recovery ventilation. It's much more technically sophisticated than the house we built 20 years ago. And you can buy it at a fixed price and literally just go and build it yourself in about a month. So where did all this come from? I did 14 years at Michael Hopkins and Partners, big London firm, and this is one of my projects, Nottingham University New Campus. And what this taught us was that the biggest problem with trying to achieve low-carbon architecture is economies of scale. What you can do on a £35 million university campus is quite different from what you can do when somebody asks you to design a single private family home. And by very careful repetition of of details, by very careful consideration of the industrial manufacturing processes within each works package, we were able to reduce the cost so that this came in at about £850 a square metre, which wasn't very much more than an absolutely bottom-of-market building regulations construction. But it was done at a large scale. What's interesting about this project is it uses very simple techniques, thermal mass, low pressure drop ventilation, photovoltaic powered heat recovery, wind assisted ventilation, passive solar gain, atrium spaces, a little bit of passive cooling from rainwater storage lakes, shelter belts. All these ideas were coming in, and what's exciting for me is that that actually genuinely changed the architectural forms. It changed the forms of the master planning. It made a pedestrian promenade beside a rainwater storage lake that the pride of place. All the cars were flung to the north. It created lots of transitory transition spaces in the form of atriums, which could provide casual meeting places for staff and students. They didn't actually cost any more than providing an external wall. And the solar electric panels shown in the middle third of that atrium roof actually power the very low pressure drop Munter wheel and heat recovery unit, which gives it reduces the heating load in the winter and reduces the cooling load because there's lots of computers in the summer. So we'll be using tricks like using staircases as return air shafts, using corridors as return air shafts, using low pressure drop floor plenums, thermally massive raised floor tiles, exposed radiant ceiling soffits, all these tricks which cost very little, but when you put them together, the whole is very much greater than the sum of the parts. So where have we moved from there to today? We're producing, we hope, the first climate neutral industrial building. This is incredibly low embodied carbon to build it in the first place, and a sufficient amount of renewable energy systems are incorporated into the building fabric to enable it to meet its annual running cost and pay back the embodied carbon of the original construction over a 25-year period. So that, if you like, the carbon debt is paid off within 25 years, and then over the rest of its life it becomes energy positive, and if the renewable energy surplus produced each year is used to offset fossil fuel electricity from the UK grid, then it actually helps to repair the climate. So this is an example of the construction process and the building design starting to really transform or really move into a new aesthetic. And what interests me is how the building form and the morphology and the planning and the spaces and the materials start to be informed by the energy efficiency and then the renewable energy harvesting techniques. And I believe that this blend of engineering, architecture creates a new aesthetic which defines the new zeitgeist. And this is important because a lot of people say, oh, well, you know, renewable energy systems, energy efficiency, it's an engineer's job, go away, you know, try and tuck it into a basement, don't let it change my architectural forms, don't let it restrict my architectural expression. And I hear this a lot. But I think where we're going is a new architectural language. This is the continuation of the modern movement, which is designed to create this survival, the infrastructure for our collective survival. So what we found on this building was that, what we found on this building was that actually, for this particular client, pretty well all of the energy consumed was electricity, and it was used for ventilation. And they had very high levels of ventilation running virtually all the time because they hadn't actually worked out that it was even worth turning these systems off. So we found in a survey that actually the building was only even occupied for 30% of its time. 70% of the time it was asleep. So we designed a building that didn't need any energy to be asleep, virtually shut down, and then when someone came into it and activated it, it woke up and used a tiny amount of energy when it did. And that's how all these tricks start to come off. So this is, possibly the industrial estate of the future, or the office park of the future. And where we got to a long time ago was a conclusion that had already been come to in this part of the world, and particularly southern Germany, with the work done by the Passive House Institute, was that actually zero heating specification was very easy if you had enough thermal mass and you had enough, reduced losses through ventilation, and you had very high levels of insulation. And then we found that being very, very careful with renewable energy systems, we could just about, over the course of a year, generate enough total electricity, for example, to meet the overall annual demand. That would mean exporting in the summer when you're generating too much, and importing in the winter when you're not generating enough. And these are really slides showing the infrared effect, showing how BedZ south facade has more or less the same, or has a better heat loss than the insulated wall of the building regulations development immediately over the fence. And we had very simple construction details using granulated blast slag cement replacement as a load-bearing inner leaf, hollow core planks spanning between cross walls, 300 millimetres of mineral wool insulation, rock wool, for its vermin resistance and non-combustion, and then any locally available rain screen, whether it's locally the nearest brickworks to the site or green oak framing. And we invented a special wall tie, which two-part wall tie, which made the construction of these 300mm cavities very easy. So this was 10 years ago or so. And what we found was that if you did this properly, and you did 300mm of insulation, triple glazing, and low-E glazing, low-E glass, actually you're able to take out a heating system. The cost of removing the heating system paid for the increase in the fabric performance. So it's a virtual circle. If you went and did only a little bit of extra insulation, then it really didn't work. And this was a slide we used at the time to get BedZ built. The next big idea is passive heat recovery ventilation. We do not subscribe to the passive house idea that you would have a fan running for the life of the building. So I'm going to show you some of these little techniques or technologies which we've developed over the years, and try and explain how that affects the architectural form and how that creates a new aesthetic and a new way of planning. So these are wind cowls. They turn to face into the wind. They're like the British oast houses that you find in Kent for hop drying. The little funnel takes fresh air in, the red takes stale air out. And as the stale air is sucked out of the building by negative pressure from the prevailing wind, it preheats incoming fresh air, giving around 70% heat recovery efficiency. So using displacement ventilation, if you duct that into the bottom of a room and you extract stale air at the top of the room, you get a room that is breathing all the time. No fan is needed, no electricity is needed. You have to fit less solar panels on your house if you want to be zero carbon. And above all, there's very little maintenance. And it generally works very, very well. And so we spent a lot of time and money wind tunnel testing these, working with Arup. This is the National Physics Laboratory in Teddington, and trying to get them to rotate down to 1.5 meters per second wind speed, and at the same time obviously measuring the suction to make sure there was enough push and pull to get the ventilation system to work. And that's part of the industrial design process. But if we hadn't tried to perfect this particular technology, it would be harder for us to deliver affordable zero-carbon solutions in the UK and other countries. We've now gone into mass production in China on this particular idea. Where we've gone to is we've modified the heat exchangers to use porous flat-plate heat exchanger plates, which are dipped in a lithium salt, which absorbs moisture from the incoming fresh air, so you get a little bit of passive dehumidification. And then we use solar evacuated tubes, solar thermal tubes, to boil the water off the lithium saline solution, regenerating it and enabling it to be passed back through the heat exchanger again. So it's a zero-waste process, and at the same time it also cleans and scrubs the air, takes out particles, reduces asthma inside the house. And the good thing is it kills SARS, which is really, really critical in certain parts of the world. So that's how these kind of technologies, if you like, call it solar dehumidification and possibly solar cooling technologies, are going to change architectural form in many parts of the world. So this is a building we've completed about 12 years ago at the Earth Centre in Doncaster, and it's a conference centre. It sits on an interseasonal heat store. It has all the heat recovery ventilation ideas, but the big innovation there was it was actually built from reclaimed materials, so about 80% reclaimed by volume. This is BedZ. This is the combined heat and power plant, and this runs on urban tree waste. So basically, urban trees grow over roads, need pruning every year, and these prunings can be chipped and burnt without, or not burnt, heated without oxygen to produce a hydrogen-rich methane gas, which is then cleaned and squirted into a spark ignition Scania truck engine, or in later slides I'll show a fuel cell. But what was interesting about this building is that it has a power station, it has a grey and black water treatment plant, that's in the glass house, it has changing rooms for the local community football pitch, it has a village hall stroke dance hall, and it has a community cafe. And that's what interests us, is combining all these rather strange functions into one shape or one roof. The least successful technology that we've been involved in has been the biomass-fueled combined heat and power plant. And frankly, the BedZ one ran just about for 1 year before the company that ran it went bankrupt, because they had to strip it down every 3 months to clean all the carbon out of the pipes. However, 10 years later, this technology is now perfected, and we're now going to reinstall that idea. So there's a lot of soul searching, a lot of ideas like this need testing. The next idea is simple solar electric panels. How does that affect architecture? Now, we've got to the point now where these panels have actually come down since this slide. They're now about £2,500 a kilowatt peak. So a 3-bedroom family house, certainly in the UK, probably in Lausanne, for certainly around €10,000 would have free electricity for the rest of its life. So this is important, and this has only happened because the developing world, particularly the Chinese and possibly the Germans, but their panels are still rather expensive, went into volume production, and the last solar panel manufacturing plant I went around employed 2,500 people and was about the size of EPFL. What we're developing at the moment is photovoltaics, which actually are integrated into the roofs of buildings. And we're developing tiles which are translucent, so that you can then create what was previously unusable attic roof space into a delightful conservatory as a non-heated extension to your living area, providing it's adequately vented. And this is a Georgian house in Southend that's just had this conversion. So I'm going to quickly show now what happens with these projects. This is a grey and black water treatment plant, the living machine at BedZ. Currently decommissioned, again, mainly due to the running cost, and all the time you need to look at the... you can get an idea that works technically, but if it costs too much to run in terms of labour, it will not survive. So what's happened now is that the water company took over this particular technology and wanted to prove their own was better, and they built an advanced membrane biofilter, which was put in a shipping container just next door to this particular installation. And of course, that's lower cost to run, but it uses double the electric consumption. So doesn't mean that this was wrong, and in certain situations this is very much right. The next idea is how to design buildings made out of reclaimed materials, because we've already extracted enough material from the ground, from the earth. And we're very proud really to see how, or to understand where your embodied carbon goes, because if you're trying to sort out climate change, embodied carbon becomes almost as important as running carbon. and certainly on very low energy buildings that becomes the case very, very quickly. But if you're trying to achieve climate neutrality, then understanding the carbon footprint of different materials and using reclaimed materials rather than new becomes absolutely critical. And there's a whole supply chain that's sprung up about how to make those ideas work. How do you scavenge steel from demolition sites and reuse it in new buildings? How do you not use new timber in new construction? So this is Bedshead in South London. And very much 20 minutes from London, Victoria, on the edge of land designated for previously for sewage treatment. Then it became designated for gravel extraction. It has cement works nearby, sewage treatment plant, concrete works, IKEA. Pretty well every antisocial activity that you can think of happens around this area. So the land is devalued, and so we were able to really take this. It was given as an experimental area, and more of this estate was going to be built on this land until we got involved working with London's oldest housing association, the Peabody Trust. And really, that's all the local people expected, or that's all they were going to get, which is bottom of the market, dormitory suburb, with very small gardens, very small windows. And this is what we managed to achieve. This is really trying at the time to be state-of-the-art, near passive house standard, reasonably medium to high density for the UK. Solar homes, using passive solar gain, very important. 50% of the external glazed screen is openable, and you can see the shade line, the shadow line running across the overhang from the floor above. So this is the real facade of the building, this glazed screen here, and it's kept pretty well all the time in shade, except in winter when you can actually do with the heat. And providing you open enough of these windows here, you get very good cross ventilation. So it's like a sort of dual facade. And the idea was to provide homes which face south and offices that face north, and put gardens on the office roofs, but above all to give each home an external area to move into as climate change starts to accelerate, so that you have outdoor living areas, a bit like you have in hotter countries, particularly the south of France. This is where I used to live when I was a student. This is the Colonies, Georgian key worker housing in Edinburgh. And what we liked about this was the fact that you had these staircases that took you up to a maisonette. You have an old people's home with flush thresholds and level access on the ground floor. And the density of this whole development is actually very high, but also the quality of the environment and the garden spaces, and it's much loved and very valuable. And we've tried to replicate that at Bedshead with homes facing south, offices facing north, so you don't get involved in expensive solar control and shading. And basically, by using the roof surfaces of the offices as garden to the housing units, we managed to get pretty well every home to have its own private defensible space or garden area. At the same time as getting about a kilowatt peak of photovoltaics for every home, very high levels of insulation, passive heat recovery ventilation, and very high levels of daylight, and very good levels of summer purge cross ventilation. So aerodynamics started to inform the building plan. And what's important is that this is the plan, Beddington High Energy Development, that the council gave themselves permission for. And this is what we built. And we managed to get all of the homes into the purple areas on this site plan. And the yellow is live-work units, the pink is pure workspace, and the light pink is shared communal facility. So by not having to pay for the land, which is about 35% of the floor area built, by not having to pay for 35% of the floor area built, or the site that sits on, you can then put that money back into the additional cost of the zero carbon construction. We've made the development permeable so that you can move through the site. It's designed to maximise the efficiency of the district heating scheme, which the biomass boiler is here. And this opens up in in a longer-term master plan to a large area of hopefully one day reclaimed parkland next to a tram stop. So this is the study that we did to look at the sun hours on the roofed gardens, because although they're facing north, they have more or less the same number of annual sun hours as a south-facing garden with a 2-metre-high perimeter fence, which is the British prevalent suburban condition. And this is the development today with, this is roof lights for the workspace below. This is roof terraces with 300 millimetres of soil on top of the workspace. This is the maisonettes. The living room on the maisonettes in this part of the scheme actually looks straight across to the roof gardens here. These are shared footbridges between two flats. And then here are the upper floor single bed flats. And here are the passive heat recovery ventilators in the form that they were 10 years ago. So this is the south facade. Here we've moved the living rooms down onto the ground floor because the gardens are on the ground floor. And this is the top floor flat interiors. And the mistake we made was building integrated photovoltaics into these sun spaces. And the re-radiation from the back of the photovoltaics was actually very high. So that didn't actually act as a shading system at all. And then the client emitted an opening light here because he said that it wasn't going to get as hot as we said it was in the summer. And that is a recipe for disaster. But we're now fitting, because it was designed to take opening lights, we're now fitting opening lights in those clear panels. So it's very interesting. And the most loved feature of this development is the fact that everybody gets a garden and a workspace. They don't and a sun space. They don't care about particularly about its environmental credentials. They care about the amenity they get, and that's what's important about this development. It's not the fact that it's a brilliant. It's even trying to be a low carbon project. It's the fact that actually we've managed to fit pretty well everything that a British suburban dweller wants at a density of 120 homes per hectare, which means that we don't have to eat up any more agricultural land to cope with the expanding British population. Because if we're importing 70% of our food, it is plainly unsustainable to continue to build on farmland. So this is the development today, and go there on a Friday evening. You can have a barbecue on pretty well most roof gardens, certainly as the weather gets warmer. This is the roofscape. We care very much about how our buildings look from above. If you fly over this, a lot of the horizontal surfaces are green. The top roof surface is sedum, and that's intended as a wildlife habitat. That's the only surface of the development that you don't actually humans can actually get onto. And these little silver discs inside the wing cowls blow open above 6 metres per second, so you don't over-ventilate your interior. This is the village square, and we had a very beautiful bar once upon a time that opened out onto it. This is the very simple passive ventilation system. There's almost no technology at all in these buildings, literally nothing. And that's the whole point. A lot of thinking and a lot of analysis, a lot of building physics modelling has gone into the design. There's virtually none in the actual development, which is quite the opposite of most engineering-led approaches to low-carbon design. So actually what's inside these houses is an oversized hot water cylinder which is connected up to a centralised CHP. And the only thing that really doesn't work that well on this project is the most complex mechanical component, which is the biofueled CHP. So in future projects, we've decided to simplify our technologies even further and rely more on the things that work really well with no moving parts, like energy efficiency and photovoltaics and passive heat recovery ventilation. But the roofscape and the landscape, this is garden areas that are raised 1,200 millimetres above the pedestrian and street. These are workspaces in here, and the idea is that you always look down on workers. Residents are always looked down on workers, and you actually get very high levels of privacy. So there can be 50 people working in a workspace in one of these offices, and there's children playing on the gardens above, and nobody seems to mind greatly. This is inside a live-work unit with a kitchen and a cupboard for people who don't like washing up, and a bed deck above. And this is one of the first projects in this part of London where you're actually encouraged to work on site, work in a residential area. And this sets up something very important called reverse commuting, because in suburban London, at rush hour, everybody gets on trains and goes into the centre, whereas here, there's a lot of people come from more central residential areas to work at BedZ. So it's what we call reverse commuting. And that doubles the capacity of public transport without any infrastructure investment at all. So these are critical ideas. This is the bar which Z Factory built inside our offices when we were in the middle of the development. And what's interesting about this is we shared an office with an environmental pressure group, and they really wound up the residents. And in the end, it got to the point where they actually shut the bar down one Christmas, because the people who really get off on low-carbon lifestyles actually don't drink very much, don't smile very much, don't really engage with the local community, don't have much joie de vivre, are really quite difficult people. So my message is that actually it's really, really important when everybody goes on to develop this kind of low-carbon world, actually it's done with a sense of humour, and above all, it doesn't alienate all the people that are not as convinced of its merits. And we found that's a major issue. Where we are now is that with these little LED lights, the whole wall can change colour according to your electric consumption. So you can immediately understand exactly what your carbon footprint is doing, because in the UK your carbon footprint is very closely related to your electric consumption. Well, it is if you live in one of our homes anyway, because you don't actually have any thermal demand other than domestic hot water. So this is inside a workspace. You can join them all up, so you can get a large unit or lots of small units, it doesn't matter. Cool North light. And what's interesting is on the sales values, it's possible to always get around about a 15% premium for this kind of development project if they're private for sale. BedZ is a third shared ownership, a third social rent, a third private for sale. But pretty well every project we've always managed to attract a slight premium, and that slight premium pays for the additional construction cost. The only problem is convincing developers to take the additional risk. So that's one case study. I'm now going to whiz through really how the same ideas can be interpreted to produce different building forms with in different places and indeed different climates. And one of the ideas we want to introduce is this idea of carbon trading in return for planning gain, where you actually analyse the area of a development allocated to housing, parking, roads and green space. That's the old Beddington High Energy development. That's BedZ here, more of pretty well everything, including extra workspace.